The frost bit at Alara's exposed fingers, the chill a living thing that had burrowed deep into her bones, numbing sensation, yet sharpening the ache of hunger. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, each exhale a fragile cloud against the unforgiving canvas of the late autumn sky. Days had blurred into an endless cycle of shivering despair, each sunrise offering no solace, only the renewed, crushing weight of utter solitude. Her meager provisions, scavenged from the tattered remains of her family's wagon, had dwindled to nothing more than a few hardened crumbs and the icy taste of despair. They had promised her a new life, a fresh start across the vast, indifferent plains, only to be swallowed by a fever that spared only her, the weakest. Now, she was less than a ghost, a wisp of a girl barely clinging to the edge of existence, lost in a landscape that devoured hope as readily as it did the feeble light of day. The silence was the most oppressive companion, vast and empty, broken only by the mournful whisper of the wind through skeletal trees, or the faint, distant cry of something unseen, something wild and predatory. She stumbled, her worn boots slipping on the frozen earth, and caught herself on the gnarled trunk of a pine, its needles sharp and indifferent. Her vision swam, the world tilting on its axis, a canvas of blurred grays and whites. Her stomach, a cavern of aching emptiness, twisted with spasms that brought tears to her eyes, quickly freezing on her gaunt cheeks. "This is it," a voice, thin and reedy like the wind, echoed within her. "This is where it ends." There was no one coming, no one left to come. The thought, once terrifying, now carried a strange, weary peace. To simply close her eyes, to let the biting cold claim her entirely, seemed less daunting than another moment of this relentless, gnawing survival. She sank to her knees, the brittle twigs crunching beneath her, a sound like breaking bones. Her hands, raw and purple, instinctively pulled her thin shawl tighter, a futile gesture against the encroaching chill. It was then, in that moment of surrender, that a shadow detached itself from the deepening gloom of the forest's edge. He emerged not with a rush, but with a deliberate, unhurried pace that spoke of an ancient patience, a man woven from the very fabric of the desolate land itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in hides that seemed to absorb the twilight, he carried himself with an innate stillness that belied his formidable presence. His face, shadowed beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat, was an enigma, weathered and marked by a life lived beyond the confines of soft civilization. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, yet there was no discernible threat in his gait, only an immense, watchful silence. Alara, frozen in her despair, found her breath catching, not from cold, but from a sudden, stark terror that had nothing to do with hunger. She was prey, and this was the hunter. He stopped several paces from her, his gaze, though unseen beneath the hat, a palpable weight upon her. No word was spoken, no gesture offered, yet his presence filled the vast emptiness around them, making her feel both utterly insignificant and, paradoxically, acutely visible. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She tried to rise, to flee, but her limbs betrayed her, weak and unresponsive. Shame, hot and unexpected, flushed through her cold veins at her helplessness, at being discovered in such a pitiful state. She braced herself for what might come: a judgment, a threat, perhaps even a cruel kindness. But he offered none of these. Instead, his hand, gloved and calloused, simply pointed, a stark finger tracing an arc towards a barely visible wisp of smoke rising from beyond a distant ridge. It was a silent command, an unstated direction, a choice: follow or remain. The wind whipped past, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, a phantom promise of warmth. The choice, though unvoiced, was clear: a slow, certain death against the desperate, terrifying gamble of following this silent, formidable stranger. Alara pushed herself to her feet, each movement a testament to a resilience she hadn't known she possessed, fueled by a primal fear of the alternative. Her legs ached, her head swam, but she forced one foot in front of the other, trailing behind Kale, the man who had yet to utter a single word. He maintained a steady, relentless pace, never looking back, never waiting. Yet somehow he was never so far ahead that she lost sight of him. He was a pillar in the shifting landscape, a dark silhouette against the fading light, leading her into an unknown as chilling as the air itself. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the sparse trees giving way to a more open, rocky terrain. Her strength, already depleted, ebbed with every step, but the thought of stopping, of collapsing in the deepening twilight, was more terrifying than the silent man ahead. As darkness finally swallowed the last vestiges of daylight, a faint, flickering glow appeared in the distance, the source of the smoke he had pointed to. It was a crude, low-slung cabin, nestled into the lee of a rocky outcrop, almost invisible against the rugged earth. Cale pushed open the heavy wooden door without a sound, and a wave of heat, rich with the scent of pine and wood smoke, enveloped Alara. It was a revelation, a shock to her senses after the relentless cold. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but meticulously kept. A roaring fire dominated the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. A simple cot, a small table, a few shelves. Cale moved with an economical grace, adding more wood to the fire, then without a glance, placed a tin cup of steaming, dark liquid coffee. She realized with a jolt, and a piece of hardtack on the table. He still hadn't spoken. Alara hesitated, then wrapped her raw fingers around the warm cup, the heat a blessing, the aroma intoxicating. She drank slowly, the bitter warmth spreading through her, chasing away some of the deep-seated cold. The hardtack was dry and tasteless, but it was food, and her body, starved for days, accepted it with a gratitude that brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He sat on a low stool by the fire, his back to her, methodically sharpening a hunting knife. The rhythmic rasp of steel against stone was the only sound in the small cabin. He was not ignoring her, she realized. He was simply being. There was no expectation, no demand, only the quiet, steady presence of a man accustomed to his own company. Over the next few days, this became their routine. He would leave at dawn, returning at dusk with game or firewood. She, still weak, would tend the fire, sweep the small space, boil water for the coffee. He never asked her to. She simply did, driven by an innate need to contribute, to prove herself more than a burden. She learned to read his subtle cues, the tilt of his head, the set of his shoulders, the brief, assessing glance that sometimes lingered on her hands as she worked. He was a man of the land, resourceful and self-sufficient, and slowly, painstakingly, Alara began to shed the layers of fear and despair, replacing them with a tentative, almost imperceptible sense of quiet purpose. The fear of him hadn't vanished entirely, but it had morphed into a wary respect, a recognition of an undeniable, if austere, protection. She was still alone in many ways, but no longer utterly adrift. The slow, quiet rhythm of their existence, a fragile truce against the wilderness, was shattered by the storm. It descended without warning, a furious, white-out blizzard that swallowed the world in a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging ice. The small cabin, once a haven, became a drum in the tempest, groaning and creaking under the relentless assault. Snow piled against the door and windows, burying them in drifts that threatened to suffocate the fragile warmth within. It was the deepest winter Alara had ever witnessed, a wrathful demonstration of nature's power. Cale moved with an urgency she hadn't seen before, securing the shutters, reinforcing the door with a thick log. His face, usually unreadable, was etched with a grim determination. He spoke then, his voice a low rumble against the shrieking wind, the first full sentence she'd heard from him. "Hold the latch." Steady, his words were clipped, direct, and Alara, her hands trembling, gripped the protesting wooden bar, pushing her full weight against it as the wind hammered at the door, trying to rip it from its hinges. The raw power of the storm was terrifying, but even more so was the chilling realization of their vulnerability. They were isolated, completely cut off at the mercy of the elements. Days blurred into a frozen eternity. The blizzard raged, unyielding, They conserved their dwindling firewood and what little food Cale had managed to gather before the storm struck. The air inside the cabin grew colder, the fire a precious, shrinking ember. Alara found herself working alongside him, not as a desperate act of survival, but as a silent, ingrained partnership. She melted snow for water, conserving every precious drop. She learned to identify the subtle shifts in the wind, the deepening groan of the cabin walls. Her hands, once raw from neglect, were now calloused and strong, hardened by use. Her eyes, once dulled by hopelessness, now held a sharp, watchful intelligence. The vulnerability had receded, replaced by a fierce, unyielding resolve. One night, the wind howled with a new, guttural intensity. Cale, who had been sitting by the dying fire, stiffened, his head cocked. Alara, attuned to his subtle shifts, felt a prickle of dread. A sound, faint yet distinct over the storm's fury, reached them, a scratching, then a heavy thud against the cabin's outer wall. Not wind, not snow. Cale moved swiftly, silently, grabbing his rifle from above the hearth. He gestured for Alara to stay low, near the fire. Her heart hammered, a frantic beat against the ominous silence that had fallen between the gusts of wind. There was something out there, something large. A growl, low and menacing, vibrated through the floorboards. He moved to the small, snow-covered window, peering out cautiously. Alara clutched a heavy poker, her knuckles white. The beast was massive, a starved bear drawn by the faint scent of their presence. Its eyes, she imagined, burned with a desperate hunger. Cale didn't speak, but his gaze, when it met hers briefly across the dim cabin, held a quiet gravity. It was not fear she saw in him, but a stark, professional assessment of the threat. She nodded, an unspoken pact forming between them. She would be ready. As the bear clawed at the door, its growls turning into snarls of frustration, Cale readied his shot. The cabin filled with the deafening roar of the rifle, followed by a guttural roar of pain. Then silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wind. They had survived. Together, the shared ordeal had forged a bond far stronger than any spoken words. The blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world hushed and glittering under an immense blanket of snow. The air was crisp, clean, carrying the promise of a tentative thaw. The bear, its life claimed by Cale's swift shot, lay frozen a short distance from the cabin, a stark reminder of the perils of this land and the quiet strength of the man who faced them. Alara no longer felt the bone-deep dread she once did at such sights. She had seen the raw face of survival, and she had met it, not with resignation, but with a fierce, burgeoning will to live. Days turned into weeks, the snow slowly receding, revealing a landscape reborn. The cabin, their sanctuary, began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a home. Alara found her rhythm in the domestic tasks, gathering dry wood, tending a small patch of earth for early spring greens, even repairing a torn seam in Cale's work coat with thread from her meager possessions. Her movements were purposeful, her face no longer etched with the shadow of despair but with a quiet, observant dignity. She had healed, physically and spiritually, finding a profound strength within the simplicity of their shared existence. The silence between them had transformed from something intimidating into a comfortable, understanding presence. Words were still scarce, but their glances, their shared tasks, their very breathing in the small space, wove a tapestry of unspoken connection. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and golden over the distant, still snow-capped peaks, Alara watched Cale from the cabin doorway. He was working by the edge of a newly cleared stream, his movements fluid and powerful as he split logs for the evening fire. The axe rose and fell with a rhythmic precision, the sound echoing softly in the stillness. He had built this place, carved out his existence from this unforgiving land. He was self-sufficient in a way she hadn't truly understood before. The sturdy cabin, the well-maintained tools, the seemingly endless supply of furs and dried meats. They spoke not of mere survival, but of foresight, of resources, of a deep, almost ancient knowledge of how to thrive where others simply perished. There was a quality to everything he owned, a quiet solidity, a careful craftsmanship that hinted at a life of order and purpose, even in this remote wild. He seemed to lack for nothing, needing no one, yet he had offered her sanctuary, without question or expectation. He paused in his work, the axe resting on the chopping block, and turned his head, his gaze finding hers across the small clearing. The late light softened the harsh lines of his face, and for the first time, Elara saw a flicker of something akin to a gentle invitation in his usually unyielding eyes. It was fleeting, easily missed, yet unmistakable. "My birthday is tomorrow," he said, his voice a low murmur, unaccustomed to such pronouncements. He shifted his weight, his gaze falling back to the axe in his hand, as if the admission had cost him something. "You can join me if you wish." The words hung in the crisp air, stark and simple, yet laden with an immense, unspoken weight. It was not merely an invitation to share a day. It was an offering of shared life, of acknowledgement, of a quiet, profound acceptance. Elara felt a warmth bloom in her chest, utterly unlike the heat of the fire or the faint warmth of the spring sun. It was the warmth of belonging, of being seen, not as a burden or a victim, but as a partner, an equal. She knew nothing of his past, his origins, or the life he had left behind to build this solitary existence. She didn't know the extent of his lands, or that the quiet, self-possessed man who had saved her, who owned the sturdy tools and the well-stocked cabin, possessed a wealth that extended far beyond the confines of their remote valley, dwarfing the meager fortunes of any town. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the unspoken bond, the quiet promise of a future built not on desperation, but on resilience, shared strength, and a dignity she had found anew in the heart of the wild.